Welcome back to another video. I'm Corbin, the leather specialist, but today I'm trying my hand at some upholstery. This is just my second upholstery project, so hopefully it's a good learning experience. I'm gonna try to make a cushion for this stool, so I'll be working with foam for the first time and also with piping for the first time. So let's see how it goes and let's dive into the project. I'm using our Stonewall leather for the top and Outdura upholstery fabric for the boxing because I love the texture of it and I thought the tan colors would look nice with the lighter wood. There were two especially satisfying parts of this project, and one mildly infuriating part. But I want to start the video off on a positive note, so here's one of the good parts. It was working with the foam, and I'm not a foam expert, but I think the industry term for this is the good stuff. I traced out the outline of the seat onto the foam with a marker. I held the marker at a 90-degree angle, which caused the circle to be about a 1/4 inch oversized, which is exactly what I wanted. I finally got to use our blade foam saw, and I'll admit it, this tool is a luxury for a new upholsterer like me, but I couldn't not use it. It's not needed for most of my leather projects, so I had to jump at the chance to use it. This is our firm Sailrite premium foam, a high-density, long-lasting foam that won't bottom out nearly as quickly as other foams. We recommend premium foam for any high-traffic application, and I sit here almost every day, so I wanted the best. It created a pretty much perfect circle. You can also cut the foam with a good pair of scissors, it just might not be quite as smooth. Especially with a 2-inch thick piece like this. The next thing I cut was some 1/2-inch batting. At first I cut a circle, but I ended up not actually using that piece. But then I cut a 3¼ inch strip to go around the sides of the foam and the stool. The batting should help smooth things out and give a little bit of cushion and a soft look on the sides where there's no foam over the wood. With those cut, I used Sailrite adhesive to adhere the foam and batting so they wouldn't shift later when I fit them into the seat cover. The top of the seat will be leather, and this sand color of our Stonewall leather has to be some of my favorite that we have. I needed a piece of leather that was a 1/4 inch larger than the foam on all sides, which means I needed to add a 1/2 inch to the diameter of the foam for my leather piece. And I thought I was going to be able to impress you all by doing some calculations with pi, but maybe I can impress you with my circle drawing skills. Because it was pretty easy with this canvas patterning ruler. I just divided my desired radius measure of 14½ which would be 7, and used that hole to mark the leather. And this is the second extremely satisfying part of the project that I mentioned earlier. Maybe it's because it felt a little bit rebellious to draw on leather with a pen, or just because there's something nice about having the perfect tool for the job. With the circle drawn, I used my leather scissors to cut it out. And if you're taking copious notes, you might have noticed I've already burnt up my two satisfying parts of the project, and the difficult part is still looming large over the video. Well, we're almost there because my mistake lies in the boxing fabric. There was nothing wrong with the fabric itself, just my decision-making process. Since I chose to use the more expensive premium foam earlier, the cheapskate part of my brain needed a win, so I decided to use this small piece of scrap as my fabric. This was plenty of fabric, but since I'm planning on adding piping, I had to cut 2-inch strips for that piping. These strips should have been cut along the bias of the fabric so they would stretch nicely around the curved seat. But with this narrow strip of fabric, I didn't really have that option to cut along the bias.
And when you make piping, usually you do it along the bias so that you get some stretch, whereas I am not. So let's see if that'll come back to bite me in the butt later.
This decision was the impetus for what would be the least fun part of the project. But before you watch me struggle, I need to cut a 3¾ inch strip for the boxing. I trimmed it to 48 inches since I knew my foam's circumference was a little over 42 inches, and I needed a few inches of extra slack. The next stretch of the project is all done at the sewing machine, starting with making the piping. I used 1/4 inch polypropylene cord because I found a 1/4 inch piping foot in the drawer of my fabricator. I think I prefer smaller piping, but hindsight is 20/20, and the foot that I found was a 1/4 inch. This is a new skill I wanted to practice as I try to become a generally more well-rounded DIYer. My piping journey got off to a great start because it was as simple as making sure the fabric edges were aligned and letting the specialized foot do the work. It's really impressive how close this foot lets you sew to the piping and how tight of a fit it creates. I made 2 strands of piping the same length as my boxing strip, which was 48 inches. If you're still watching this just to see the part where I struggle, well, it's right here as I sew the piping to the leather.
Okay,
To start, I left about 4 inches of slack, which would make joining the ends together easier later. As I started to sew my very stretch-resistant piping around the curved edge, it just wasn't working the way I wanted it to.
What's going on? It's not moving.
It was very difficult to manipulate the fabric into a circle, and the fabric wasn't feeding through the machine at all. I was stuck sewing in the same exact place. But after I contemplated scrapping the whole thing, I stared at it for a bit and came up with 2 solutions. Firstly, I needed to make some relief cuts to the piping so that I could actually create curves. And maybe this slightly hurts durability since now there's all these tiny cuts in the fabric, but for the most part, it solved that problem. The second discovery was just how important the heel of the piping foot is. Since my assembly is one big curve, the piping wasn't landing in the groove of the heel, which is what caused my fabric feeding issues. So my process was to sew dozens of about 1 inch straight-ish lines while I pushed the piping into the grooves of the presser feet so that it would feed properly. Since there was very limited flexibilities, my fingers got quite a workout here. But to my surprise, the final result actually looked pretty good. I suppose it's like those rounded brick buildings where enough small straight lines can gradually come together to make a smooth curve. When I made it back around to the starting point, I opened up the piping and trimmed down the cord to the correct length. I folded a hem on the end of the fabric, overlapped the fabric onto the opposite end of the piping, and sewed it into place. After giving my fingers a quick break, I placed the boxing fabric to the piping with the right sides touching. Just like with the piping, I left a few inches of slack unsewn to start the seam. And since I knew what to expect this time, I had a strategy in place and it went more smoothly, although I still took it pretty slow. I figured out where the joint for the 2 fabric pieces would need to be, pinned the fabric together at that spot, and sewed it. I trimmed off a bit of extra fabric before fanning out those flaps to reduce bulk and sewing the gap closed. And that completes all the sewing for this project. So I turned it right side out to reveal a surprisingly good looking assembly, which was quite a relief. Now I know I've already given you my 2 highlights and 1 lowlight of the project, but don't go anywhere just yet because there's one more little surprise. The foam fit into the cover nice and snug, and I made sure that the bulk rested along the boxing, not the surface of the seat. I was a little worried that I wouldn't have enough fabric to grab onto and staple to the bottom, so that's why I removed the batting circle I had just to be safe. I used the long nose upholstery staple gun and 3/8 inch staples. I set a couple of temporary staples on each side and gradually started stapling around. The way I checked myself as I stapled was by comparing the distance between my workbench and the piping. I did end up having enough fabric to staple down, but it was slightly more difficult to tension the fabric since there was less to grab onto while I pulled. But I found that these edge match pliers were very helpful as I stapled around the edge. I did have to pull a handful of staples to increase tension in a few spots, just so there wasn't any big dips where the piping sat. After a few adjustments, I was happy with the look, although if I'm being a little picky, I could have used a bit more tension all the way around. Finally, I added the second strand of piping to the underside of the stool. I set a few staples to hold it in place before adding some cardboard tack strip. That'll give the piping a little extra structure. Just like with the piping, I had to cut some reliefs in the tack strip so it could curve around the stool. Then I stapled all the way around and joined the ends of the piping the exact way I did before. And I promised one more small surprise, so here it is. I decided to add 2 small holes into the legs of the stool. And then momentarily later, I realized that those holes were the same distance as a little pouch I made. So I added some screws and put the 2 things together. It's pretty nice. Because I'm firmly of the opinion that you can never have too many little pockets available. So thanks for following along on this video. I had a lot of fun doing just my second upholstery project, and it really wasn't that hard, so you can do it too, I promise. And with that being said, I will finish the outro in the comfort of my brand new stool. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.